So we only have two more left. We're working through these glory signs that John lays out for us regarding who Jesus is, what his identity is. And so I've titled this "Seeing Jesus with Muddy Eyes." And so this is such a great story. I don't know if these stories excite you like they do me. And every time I always feel bad because I'm always like, this is my favorite story. And you're like, you said that last week, okay? So I realize the irony of that I say that a lot. But this one's really good. I'll give you a couple reasons why that I particularly like it. You might not like it for the same reasons that I do, but in John 9, and by the way, it's the whole chapter. I'm not going to read the whole chapter, but it's all 41 verses where this story takes place in John 9. I'll read some of it in a little bit. But the reason I love this story is because I love a good theological myth-busting. Do you understand? So have you guys ever seen the show Mythbusters? I mean, you at least know of it. They literally had 18 seasons beginning in 2003. 18 seasons, okay? I don't know how you can even have a show that has that many seasons. But, and they did incredible work, like big questions, like can a can of biscuits explode and kill somebody, And they tested this to see, can you use a can of biscuits as a bazooka? That was literally one of the episodes. Things like, can you actually get stuck in an airplane bathroom up in the air because a lady apparently was said to have gotten stuck in the bathroom because of something to do with the flow of the air, and so they wanted to, bust that myth that was a possibility. They had a whole episode on duct tape because there's all kinds of things about duct tape, right? Of like all the amazing things duct tape can do. It can do anything. You know what they found? They found that those myths are not myths. They are correct. Only one of them was incorrect, and that was that it can't necessarily stop a leaky boat from continuing to leak for a certain period of time. But all the other ones, that you can use it for all kinds of things, was proven to be true. That was deeply meaningful to me. So I love this idea of taking a common held idea and, just taking it out. And that's kind of weird to do a machine gun. It just came to me because we said bazooka was in my head, But these theological ideas that we hold up as just common, this is just how it is, and to break that down, I like that idea because I feel like there's a lot of theological, practical things that we hold that aren't legitimate. In fact, a lot of the songs we sing have theological assumptions woven into them that may or may not be correct. We sang some songs today, songs I like, that there's a couple of theological things in there that I'm going, that's probably not correct. Maybe we should bust that myth sometimes. But it's everywhere in what we practice and what we think. And so Jesus, I like this text because Jesus takes out one of the common theological assumptions of the day. And how he does it is quite interesting to me. So that's one of the reasons I like this. Another reason I like this is because it involves Jesus using mud pies to heal somebody. And if you've ever watched a 2-year-old eyeing a mud puddle with that deep longing that they have, you'll know that there's a deep longing in the heart of just being a human, and that is this longing to play in the mud. I have it. In fact, I think I was like 17. I had a friend, and we were at this building that had this huge, it had just rained, and it was just like this huge, 300-foot mud puddle. And we were, he was like 18, I was 17. We were very mature for our age, We were just dressed in normal kind of business casual clothes, and we stood there looking at that puddle, and he said, "You want to?" And he went and did a cannonball, right there. And I was like, yeah, somebody who understands me, So there we were, swimming around in the mud puddle. But I consider that a sign of health, emotional, psychological health, that you haven't lost the thrill of the puddle. And some of you are just, you're looking at me weird. I'm sorry for you. You've lost the thrill of the puddle, okay? And so this text gets us back to that, at least in some way. Jesus literally spits into the dirt, makes a mud pie, and slaps him on this dude's eyes, and I just love that whole thing, okay? Now, obviously, there's deeper symbolic things happening with that mud, okay? As you have probably figured out by now in the book of John, almost everything has some kind of like deeper idea. So we'll get to that. But I just like this story, so let's look at the story in John 9. I'm not going to read the whole chapter because it's too long for us just this morning, but I want you at least to see the first part and the last part. We're going to skip over the middle part, and I'll tell you why in just a second. This is John 9:1. As Jesus was going along, he saw a man who had been born blind from birth. That's key information. It's not something that he contracted, some disease that afflicted him. He literally has been blind his whole life. Okay, so that raises the level of what it would take for this person's sight to be restored. He's never had sight. Okay? Verse 2. Teacher, his disciples asked him, whose sin was it that caused this man to be born blind? Did he sin or did his parents? So you can understand kind of the vibe of what's happening here. Jesus is like the rabbi. He's got these disciples. They're walking around. Here's this dude that apparently it's common knowledge this dude has been blind from birth. We don't get all the information how they knew that, but apparently they knew that. And so you can just imagine one of the disciples says, Rabbi, I have a question. Like, here's a good one. Listen to this. I got this great, deep theological conundrum question. Can God make us something so big that, he's going to do one of these little, like, mind-bending, like, how do we? So he's got this really great theological question to see how Jesus will answer it. And the question is, here's this blind dude. Obviously, somebody sinned. Either he did or his parents. Otherwise, he wouldn't be blind. So whose sin was it? There's the theological conundrum. Jesus doesn't accept the assumption. He says, what? He says, he didn't sin, replied Jesus, nor did his parents. It happened so that God's works could be seen in him, which is a really strange thing to say. We must work the works. So Jesus doesn't explain to them his reasoning for their whole false assumption. He's going on a different track. This is his track. We must work the works of the one who sent me as long as it is still daytime. The night is coming, and nobody can work then. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. With these words, he spat on the ground and made some mud out of his spittle. He spread the mud on the man's eyes. Off you go, he said, and wash in the pool of Siloam, which means sent. And he went off and he washed. And when he came back, he could see. Now we're going to stop right there because now for the next verses from verse 8 to 34, which is a pretty long read, it is all about the interrogation that takes place with the neighbors who now see that this man that's been blind since birth that they know, they're trying to figure out what happened. And so they asked him, what happened? And he's like, this guy they called Jesus put mud on my eyes, sent me off to this water, I washed it, and I can see now. And so they're like, what? We got to take you to the Pharisees. So the Pharisees were kind of the spiritual religious leaders of the synagogue. So they take him to the Pharisees, and they say, listen to what this guy has to say. He was blind, now he can see. Now the Pharisees, they begin to interrogate this guy. Like, what happened? Who did this? What did he do? So you read through this long interrogation scene, and then it says in verse 18, the Judeans didn't believe that he really had been blind and could see. So this is like, wait, there's no way this happened, so he must have not been blind from the beginning. Let's call his parents. So they call the parents in, and the parents are now interrogated. Now, backstory, John's going to give us this in just a few verses. The parents know that the rumor that's been going around is that anybody who lines up with Jesus gets kicked out of the synagogue. That's the backstory. So here they are. They're nervous because this is about Jesus. He's already a hot topic. And they already know that the religious leaders, the conservative religious leaders of that day, in that culture, have already said, if you line up with this guy, if you call him Messiah, you're kicked out of the synagogue. So what you're the parents, they're getting ready to grill you about what Jesus did. You know your son was blind from birth. He's your son. And now he can see. So they said to them, is this really your son? The one that was born blind? How can it be that he can now see? Well, his parents replied, we know that this is indeed our son and that he was born blind, but we don't know how it is that he can now see. We don't know who it is that opened his eyes. Even if they knew, they weren't saying his name. Not there, because they'd get kicked out of the synagogue. Ask him. He's grown up. He can speak for himself. So deflection. Good idea. His parents said this. Here's the backstory John gives us. Because they were afraid of the Judeans. The Judeans, you see, had already decided that if anyone declared that Jesus was Messiah, they should be put out of the synagogue. This is why the parents said, he's grown up, so you should ask him. So this was an intimidation tactic that was put in place to come to the conclusion that they had already come to. Jesus is not the Messiah. And if you say he is, intimidation tactics begin. Now, little side note, anyone who uses intimidation tactics within the religious space of Christianity, big red flag. They are not the Jesus way. Should be pretty obvious. But this is how it always works. I've been in churches where pressure and guilt and intimidation have been used to get people to march to the beat of the drum they want them to march to. Big red flag. If I start using intimidation, if I start using guilt as a way to get you guys to do anything, give anything, think anything, then that should be a huge red flag that I am not walking the way of Jesus. Do you hear what I'm saying? This is like Christianity 101. But this was the situation, and so the parents had to kind of deflect it. So it says for the second time, these religious leaders called the man back in. Get him back in here. Let's grill him one more time. I love how they say this. Give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner. You see, so they get him. They already have decided Jesus is a sinner, that he's a fraud, that he's a fake. So they bring the guy in who's been healed by Jesus. He's never seen till now. Can you just imagine the scene? They're all gathered around him, and he's like in the center of the circle, you know? They're like, praise be to God. Give glory to God. This man you're talking about is a sinner. We already know it. I love what this guy says. Unlike the dude who was lame and got healed, and he was kind of like, I don't know who healed me. I don't know who he is. I don't know what he's doing. He was kind of confused about the whole thing. This guy has some clarity. He says, I don't know whether he's a sinner or not, replied the man. All I know is this. I used to be blind, but now I can see. What did he do to you? They asked. How did he open your eyes? There's some trickery going on here. He said, I told you already, and you didn't listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples too? That was good. That was great. I wrote a little smiley face in my Bible right next to that because I think that's really funny. They were like offended, obviously. You're his disciple, they scoffed, but we are Moses' disciples. Ooh. That was kind of the point. You know, it's like they're all like, we're Moses' disciples. I'm not busting on Moses. I love Moses. But they're missing the whole point of what is happening. And they said, but we don't know where this man comes from. We know where Moses came from, but we don't know where this man comes from. So here's the guy again. He's like, well, here's a fine thing. You don't know where he's from, and he opened my eyes. We know that God doesn't listen to sinners. Now, here's this logic of this man born blind who was a beggar his whole life. And here's his logic. We know that God doesn't listen to sinners, But if anyone is devout and does his will, he listens to them. So he's using their own theological grid against them. They're saying, you would say, if someone's a sinner, God's not going to listen to them. He's just parroting back their theology. But if they're devout and they're honoring the law and they're going in the right direction, God will listen to them. It's never, ever been heard of before that someone should open the eyes of a person born blind. If this man wasn't from God, he couldn't do anything. So he gives some airtight logic based on their own way of seeing the world. Okay? And so that obviously makes them mad. And so they say, you were born in sin from top to toe, they reply. And you are going to start teaching us? And they threw him out. So his good logic is met by aggression, even violence, kicked out of the synagogue, the local assembly of the Jewish people where they could go and gather around the Torah together. So this brings us to verse 35. Jesus heard that they had thrown the man out, so he found him and spoke to him. He said to him, do you believe in the Son of Man? Who is he, sir? Asked the man, so that I can believe in him. You have seen him, replied Jesus. Remember, he's talking about the eyes now. He's talking on two spaces. You have seen him. He's talking about physically. This man can now see. But there's something more. There's a deeper seeing that Jesus is pointing to. You have seen him. In fact, the person who's talking to you, it's me. Yes, sir, said the man, I do believe. And he worshiped him. Jesus says, I came into the world for judgment so that those who can't see would see, and so that those who can see would become blind. Some of the Pharisees nearby had heard this, so they said, we are blind too, are we? See, they got the message. They knew that Jesus wasn't just talking about physical sight, he was talking about spiritual sight. They caught his implication, and so they were offended by it. Oh, so you're saying we're blind, are you? Jesus says this, if you were blind, you wouldn't be guilty of sin. But now because you say, we can see, your sin remains. Would you pray with me as we just talk through this for a couple minutes? Lord, I just pray that this text would just kind of like give us some ways of thinking, maybe some new ways of thinking about what you're trying to accomplish in our hearts and lives in a spiritual place. And so that we can better understand who Jesus is and what it looks like to keep pressing in and following him. And it's in your name we pray. Amen. So just a couple of thoughts here before we go and enjoy some good soup and coffee and all that. So I just want you to think about this, first of all, this religious assumption that Jesus busts. I want to think about that for just a second. And then I want you to consider like the new understanding. So it's like turning the lights out, because these religious assumptions that aren't necessarily true or valid, it's kind of like hanging out in the darkness a little bit. So what Jesus does, he turns the lights on. So there's like a new understanding given. And then I want you to think about these muddy eyes on this blind man. These muddy eyes actually allow him to see clearly. There's the light again. And then I want you to think about these clear eyes, the Pharisees and the religious leaders, who their eyes were clear. In more ways, not just physically, but they were clear as far as they had the Torah, they had all the answers, they had everything figured out. And yet Jesus says, because you say you can see, you're actually blind. And so this should say something to us about the posture of our own hearts toward Jesus. So real quickly, what does Jesus do with this religious assumption? So in this day, it was kind of assumed that if there was some kind of physical deformity or disability, that there had to be a correlating spiritual cause attached to it. For Jewish folk, because they didn't just think in individualistic terms like we tend to do in our current situation. We just think tend to think about ourselves individually as the center of the world. They thought of the family as kind of the centerpiece. So it was them inside of a family context. And so if there was an issue of somebody like this individual who was born blind, then either he had to have sinned, or but they're like, but he was born blind from birth. How could it have been his sin? So it must have been his family's sin that caused him to end up in this physical disability. This was kind of a common assumption within the context that John is describing Jesus is working in. And so you say, well, that's an old way of thinking. It is, but it also plays into just some common assumptions we have. I mean, it wasn't too long ago, I think back in like 1999, there was a soccer coach in England. He was the England's national team coach, whatever. He was being interviewed by Times, and they were asking him questions, and he was kind of quoted as saying something like this: the disabled and others are being punished for sins in their former life. That was his concept of why people were in the suffering they were in. So he was speaking, I think, in terms of like karma. And so karma, like in Hinduism, is this idea, it's like this basic law of moral cause, and all our actions and our attentions, they somehow affect our future reincarnation. Do you understand what I'm saying? You've heard people, but when we talk about karma like in North America, not from a Hinduistic perspective, we usually just mean a bad person doing bad things is going to be revisited to them, right? Watch out for karma, it'll get you, or a good person doing good things, it'll be revisited to them. The problem is that idea has kind of seeped into the church, where we assume if we're well fed and things are going well for us and our business is good and life is good, we must have deserved it. We must have done something because God is really being good to us. He's blessed us so much. We must have walked this holy way or done all these great things so much that God says, oh, I just love Stephen. I'm just going to make his life better. Okay, so Jesus is busting this whole way of thinking. It's completely false. Yes, there is this idea that when you do something, there's consequences. Absolutely. That's just kind of the way the world works. That's not what Jesus is saying is a problem. He actually says to them, the way you're thinking of how sin works and how God works is wrong. This specific case has nothing to do with this man's sin. Sin isn't the issue here. Sin is not the cause of every form of suffering. It's not a one-to-one connection. And so, these ideas, they're poor because they're lazy or bad. They're sick because they must have done something for which is the punishment of God or just the nature of karma. They're poor because they deserve to be poor because of something they've done. All these concepts that we allow to seep into our framework, I think what Jesus is doing is he's saying it's not that simple. He doesn't explain it all to us, but he just says, wrong. It's not the man's sin. Wrong. It's not the parent's sin. So I think what's happening here, we do this because we kind of need this. So if we can, in our own hearts and minds, see a situation that we label as unfair. If you see a person on the side of the road begging, and you know they've been blind from birth, and you're looking at this situation, there's a way in which you need to be able to be okay with this situation and be able to go to bed at night and wash your hands of it and continue to live in your comfort and your ability to see and the things that are going well for you that are not going well for this person. And so one of the ways we do that is we deflect or we distance ourselves theologically. Oh, there must be a sin problem here. So I can disconnect myself from the suffering of humanity because that's not my issue. Their issue is there was a sin problem. Either they sinned or their parents sinned. That's not my problem. That's their problem. So we can distance ourselves. The other scenario is more difficult for us because if we recognize this right here is unfair. Well, then that takes to some deeper roots on how we think about God. Because if you're looking at this person and say, it's not fair that this person was born blind from birth, then you have to come up with some way of figuring out how that works with God then. Because you say that God is a God of justice. But here's a perfect example of a situation that is totally unfair. He did nothing to deserve to be blind. How are you going to say God is just when this is an illustration when it doesn't appear that God is being just? Why is he suffering and I'm not? If it has nothing to do with the fact that we earned not suffering. Does that make sense? And if the issue is God's justice, maybe it even goes deeper than that. Maybe it's that God just isn't powerful enough. Maybe he cares about this dude, but he's not powerful enough to have stopped him from being born blind. Or maybe it's even deeper than that. Maybe if God isn't powerful enough and God can't create this justice, maybe it's just that God doesn't actually care. Maybe God isn't good after all. He just doesn't care about this guy who's blind. You see how it gets really tense? The easier thing to say is, somebody sinned, and walk away. So, why do we do this? Why do we have this challenging kind of conversation in our own hearts and our own heads? I think it really goes back to our just desire to feel okay with our situation and ourselves. And if we can have some kind of assumptions that keep it nice and clean and distant, then we can be okay. Instead of wrestling with the deeper issues of God's justice and God's power and God's goodness, that gets really nerve-wracking and will literally internally break us down. So, here's just the fact about being a human. We tend to believe what makes us feel better about ourselves. And this isn't just you, this is me. Like, I'm going to tend to slip into some beliefs that make me feel better about myself. And this was happening in this culture. It's still happening today. And so Jesus simply bursts it. And he just says, guys, that whole way of looking at the world, wrong. Has nothing to do with his sin, has nothing to do with his parents' sin. This has to do with the issue of timing, is what Jesus' answer is. And he doesn't really give us a full understanding of why suffering happens to certain people. That's not what Jesus is doing. He doesn't even go down that road. He just says, you're thinking wrong about it. Let me tell you what you should be thinking about in this situation. You should be thinking about, what time is it? That's what you should be thinking about, because that's where Jesus goes. He goes to this issue of timing, which really doesn't answer the question. But Jesus isn't really concerned to answer this question. What he wants to do is say, there's something bigger happening that you should be concerned with right now. We must work the works of the one who sent me as long as it is still daytime. The night is coming, and then nobody can work. As long as I am in the world, I'm the light of the world. So two things that Jesus wants them to think about. What time is it? It's the time when the light of the world is here, so we should be doing everything we can in light of the light that is right here. And then, who is it that is standing in front of you? The issue is not, what's this guy problem? Who sinned? The issue is, Jesus, you're right here. The one who brings light into the world is literally standing by a dude who's deep in physical darkness. The question wasn't about this man sinned. The question was who is literally standing right in front of them. So Jesus doesn't answer all the theological questions that we have, but he does say, look at me. So this opportunity is a setup for Jesus to display his glory. So we only have a few minutes left, so I need to talk about the mud and then close it out. So Jesus does something strange. He spits into some mud, some dirt, and makes little mud pies and sticks them on his eyes. And then he says to this blind man, go and wash in the pool of Siloam. So he goes off, and when he comes back, he could see. So this man goes from being some kind of like case study on theology, Jesus, who sinned? Like this conversation between a rabbi and his followers, a case study on human suffering. And he goes from being this case study on human suffering to an actual person who experiences divine mercy. A person who gets to be a signpost pointing to the glory of Jesus. So Jesus initiates this moment of clarity about who he is, and to do it, he uses dirt and spit. You could ask the question, why does he do this? Why didn't he just go, take out a little wand and go, abracadabra, or why didn't he just like in some of the other miracle story, he touches them or something, but this one he does something very specific, and so you have to ask the question, why? And there's a few reasons that scholars say. There's a couple of things that could be happening. Back in this day, any kind of like bodily, fluids were considered unclean. Spit, for example. Blood, all these things are all considered unclean unless somebody has the authority to make them a cleansing agent. And so Jesus is claiming that he has the authority to make what is unclean, spit and mud, spit and dirt, clean. So that's one thing. But also Jesus is actually doing something that points back all the way to the Old Testament, all the way to the Hebrew Scriptures in the book of Genesis. Remember what God does in making humans? What does he use to make humans in this divine picture of humanity? Do you guys remember what God does? Clay, yeah, he uses dirt or clay, and he kind of creates humanity out of that. And so Jesus is kind of mirroring that creative work, and he takes the clay and he forms it to open the eyes of this blind man. So he's literally causing new creation to come in effect and pointing back to the book of Genesis. Remember what God did when he created humanity? I'm doing a little version of that called new creation. But I think what Jesus is also doing is he's illustrating something very important. He's illustrating that the way spiritual sight works is not that everything is no longer confusing and clear. Spiritual sight works as we see through this mud, this divine gift of the grime that is on our eyes. It's not that we have to be totally understanding of everything of who Jesus is and what he's up to. Like our eyes are open and clear and we see clearly. Actually, it was the opposite for this guy. The closer he got to Jesus, the cloudier it got, and it was through that cloud of confusion and suffering and pain that the miracle comes, that he can see. I know this is a little bit deep, but this is really critical. The issue here is more than just physical sight. It's spiritual sight that's at stake, right? It's not just about this guy's physical eyes. It's will he recognize Jesus for who he is? Spiritual sight. So Jesus seems to be saying that those who have the added advantage of having unclear eyes and know it, they're actually in a better position to have their spiritual eyes opened. Does that make sense? This is really big. So if you were to come to me and say, I have this all figured out, Stephen, I've got it, I've read the Bible, I've got this all figured out, it's all clear to me now. I know how God works. I know what the cross is all about. I know I know how the Bible works. I know who Jesus. I've got it all figured out. Then I would literally be freaked out that you were completely blind. And I promise you I would. I'd probably have to tell you at that point. I mean, the very fact that you assume you know all this is a huge red flag that you literally know nothing. What I'd be more excited about is for you to come and say, Stephen, I am so confused about who Jesus is. I don't understand. I am crying because I don't understand why he's allowing things to happen the way he's allowing. My heart is breaking for my neighbors and my country and these people and my own heart and my own family and friends. It's a mess. I have no clue. I don't even know if I believe this. I don't know what Jesus is doing. I don't know if God is good. What am I supposed to do? I'd be saying, hallelujah. you're so much closer to actually seeing Jesus for who he is. The mud is all over your eyes, but that is exactly where Jesus wants you to be. So, I think this is why John goes into such great detail to explain why the religious leaders keep interrogating Jesus, interrogating the dude, interrogating his family, because they are dead set at not trusting and believing in Jesus, so much so that they will set up whatever system they can to have their way, to make it work their way. And Jesus is saying they are completely in the dark to the glory of who I am. But here's a guy who's been blind from birth, and with mud on his eyes, he sees clearer than the most learned scholars of the day, because he sees the reality of who I am. And that's why he comes to this guy, and he says, I love the little conversation he has with him. He says, do you see the person you're talking to? And the man says, yes, I do, and I believe. And then the text says, and he worshiped him. I love that part. Do you know where this all heads? So this is the process, and this is helpful for you. The removal of blindness for this man had some sorting time. He didn't know exactly who Jesus was or what this was all about. He's in this conversation with the Pharisees, with the neighbors. They're all confused. And then there's this clarification of who Jesus is. And then his heart says, I do believe. This is the moment where his heart, and I don't think that he says, I do believe once, and then it's never a question again. I don't think that's the point. I think he's responding to Jesus' question in that moment. Do you see me? Do you understand whom I am? Do you believe that I am who I say I am, the light of the world? And he goes, I do believe. And then the immediate next line is, and he worshiped him. So here's the problem. Many of us come to church and we engage weekly in worship. But we've never clearly seen who Jesus is. We've checked all the religious boxes. We have all these religious assumptions. We've done the good things. We've given money. But my nervousness with every church I've ever pastored, with every group I've ever spoke to, and my own heart daily, not just you guys, me, is that in all this activity, in all this serving, in all this worship, and all the great stuff, that we would fail to see Jesus because we think we have it all figured out. And that is always the sign that we're literally missing it all. So what do? We come back like the dude who is blind and we say, Jesus, we can't see. We've got mud in our eyes, our hearts are heavy, things are broken, we're confused, we don't know what to do next. If you don't help us, if you don't turn the lights on, we will never see again. And so Jesus says, do you see me? We say, yes, we see you. We believe and we worship. And the next day, we have to do it again. We have to learn to see through muddy eyes. That's my point. We have to learn to see through the confusion and the sadness and the weight of everything that's broken and daily say, yes, I believe, Jesus, in you, that you truly are the light of the world, and then we worship. But this is the heart posture of those who are following Jesus, and I want to encourage you to take on this posture with me and to see Jesus clearly through muddy eyes. Would you bow your heads and close your eyes?